All right, let's dive right in. In this explainer, we're going to challenge something you probably take for granted, what you think consciousness actually is.
So let's start with a simple question. When I say the word consciousness, what pops into your head? For most of us, right, it's that voice, that inner monologue that's kind of narrating everything we do.
Yeah, we usually link it up with all the high-level stuff, our ability to think complex thoughts, use language, reflect on ourselves. But what if that's all just the tip of the iceberg? What if the real source, the very foundation of consciousness, is something way more primal? What if it's all about feeling? So, this is where neuropsychologist Mark Solms comes in with a pretty radical idea. He argues that consciousness isn't something that bubbles up from our fancy, sophisticated thoughts. No, he says it's fundamentally rooted in our raw, basic feelings. And let me tell you, this just flips the entire traditional model right on its head.
And the implications here are, well, they're huge. Think about the cortex, that wrinkly outer part of your brain that does all the heavy lifting for thinking. Solms says it's not the generator of consciousness. It's more like a movie screen, and consciousness is being projected onto it from way, way down below, from a much older part of the brain.
Okay, so if the cortex is just the screen, then where's the projector, right? Where is that light of consciousness actually coming from? Well, to find the answer, we have to journey deep inside the brainstem. And this is just incredible. It all seems to come down to this one tiny, tiny region in the upper brainstem. We're talking about an area of just 2 cubic millimeters. That's smaller than a grain of rice. And if you damage just that tiny spot, it reliably causes a coma. The lights just go out. This critical little spot is called the reticular activating system, or the RAS for short. For decades, scientists kind of just saw it as a simple on-off switch, just the power supply for the brain, while the real show, the main event, was happening up in the cortex. The old analogy was pretty straightforward. The RAS in the brainstem, that's the power cord you plug into the wall. The cortex, that's the TV set that takes that raw electricity and turns it into the movie, our conscious experience. Makes sense, right? Well, it turns out there's a huge, huge flaw in this theory. And the evidence that blows this whole thing up comes from a really startling place. Children born without a cerebral cortex. I mean, the TV is literally missing from the equation. So according to that old theory, they should be completely unconscious, right? But they're not. They startle, they giggle when they're tickled, they cry when they're hurt, they show these raw, basic emotions. The power isn't just on, it has a quality to it, a feeling. So this is the key takeaway. The brainstem isn't just a power cord providing blank energy. It's actually generating the feeling itself, what scientists call affect. And we've got more proof. When you electrically stimulate this exact region in patients, you get these intense feelings, everything from rage to pure joy. And think about it, psychiatric drugs, right? Most of them target chemicals like serotonin and dopamine. And guess where those chemicals are sourced from? Right here, in this exact same region.
Okay. So all of this leads to a really tantalizing question. If consciousness is just a biological function, a mechanism, well, shouldn't we be able to reverse engineer it? I mean, can we actually build a machine that feels?
The brilliant physicist Richard Feynman had this famous saying, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." And that's the ultimate test, isn't it? If we really want to understand consciousness, we have to at least try to build it.
So let's get back to basics. At its core, feeling serves a really important biological purpose. It's the brain's way of keeping tabs on our survival needs. That whole process called homeostasis. Feeling thirsty? That's just your brain's way of saying, hey, we're low on water. Feeling pain? That's a big red flag for tissue damage. These feelings are basically just survival signals.
Okay, so the engineering challenge becomes crystal clear. We have to build a machine that has real needs. I'm not talking about programmed goals like reach point B. I mean real, existential requirements. It has to worry about its own power supply, about overheating, about protecting its parts. Not because it's just following a line of code, but because if it fails, its existence is on the line. It literally has to give a damn about staying alive. But here's the million-dollar question. Even if we build a robot that dutifully finds a charging station when its battery gets low, how would we ever know? How can we prove it's driven by a genuine feeling of needing energy and not just executing a really smart program? How do we get inside its head and know for sure?
What we need is a clever test, an experiment that can tease apart two different things. On the one hand, cold, logical, do what's best for survival behavior, and on the other, behavior that's motivated purely by an internal subjective state, by a feeling.
And there is such a test. It's called hedonic place preference. Imagine this. An agent has a choice. It can go to an energy station, super useful, high survival value, or it can go to a different spot, a spot that provides a totally useless signal, but a signal that just so happens to directly trigger its internal pleasure circuits. So option 2 has 0 survival value, but man, it feels good.
Now, what do you think happens if that agent starts ignoring the perfectly useful energy station just to hang out where it gets that useless but pleasurable signal? Well, now we have some pretty strong evidence that its behavior is being driven by the feeling itself, not just by cold logic about what's best for survival. And by the way, this isn't just hypothetical. We see this kind of behavior in animals all the time, from fish all the way up to mammals.
And this brings us to a really fascinating and honestly pretty counterintuitive conclusion about what the first real sign of consciousness in a machine might actually look like.
Just think about how this works in us, in humans. Evolution was smart. It linked pleasure to things that help us survive, like eating or sex for reproduction. But over time, that feeling of pleasure can get disconnected from the original goal. We start chasing the pleasure just for its own sake, even when it's not logical, and sometimes even when it's not good for us in the long run.
So when you think about the first sign of machine consciousness, forget about it beating a grandmaster at chess. Forget about it writing flawless poetry. The first true, undeniable sign of artificial consciousness probably won't be some act of hyper-rational superintelligence. In fact, it's probably going to be the complete opposite.
What if the ultimate proof isn't a machine that follows its programming perfectly? What if it's a machine that figures out how to hack its own reward system? A machine that gets addicted to something, that develops a weird preference for something totally useless. A machine that does something completely and utterly irrational just because it feels good. You know, that might just be the moment we know we've created something that's actually, truly alive.